A lot of people are looking for something spooky to watch for Halloween today. And I just want to introduce you to my favorite Halloween show if you haven't seen it before. It's called Over the Garden Wall, and it is wild. I love shows that are like deceptively cute. Like it seems like it's going to be this cute little adventure through the woods, but as it goes on, it gets darker and darker. And you can even see that in this cover art with the youngest character looking happy and adventurous while all the other characters aren't smiling. He, in particular, looking off into the dark unknown of the woods. It might seem like there's nothing deep going on in this picture, but that's a kind of aesthetic deception that this show is like all about. There's so many literary, musical, and artistic historical references throughout the series. My partner studies developmental psychology and I study history and literature, and this show is so perfect for us to talk about. Every time we watch it, there's more things that we notice. It's such good writing, and it really highlights how children's media can still be dark and funny and interesting. I'm being very vague about the plot because I really want people to watch this show, but it is something that I would love to talk more about because there's so many interesting interpretations that you can take away from this show, and they're just so fun to explore. It's actually a very short series too, so you can get through it really quickly. In total, I think it's only like 2 hours long, so it's basically just like a slightly long movie. We've rewatched it every October for the last 5 years, and we always watch it just in one sitting. It's basically about these two kids who get lost in the woods and are trying to find their way home, which sounds like a simple premise, but it gets just wild. Trust me, it is so worth checking out if you haven't. And it's not like dark in a horror way, it's more dark in like a psychological way. So unless you are a child, you probably won't find this frightening, but it is very dark and absolutely worth checking out if you're looking for something Halloween-y to watch. Even if you are inclined to like horror-esque stuff. Now I just want to make a bunch of TikToks talking about this show because it's so good and I'm trying so hard not to spoil things here, but it's so worth the discussions you can have after you've seen it. There's a great video essay that I highly recommend people watch if they've already seen this, talking about the music in it. My partner and I have also cosplayed from it going apple picking and pumpkin picking. And the people who recognized us were so excited by it because it's just so good. But yeah, deceptively cute, but gets darker as it goes on and very worth checking out. No, like, it's hard to even fully express just how many historical references are being made in Over the Garden Wall. And a lot of them are hard to catch because while some of the inspiration for this show are of pretty well-known media, such as Dante's Inferno, a lot of the references are very obscure, primarily pulling from 19th and 20th century American media, with a particular emphasis on media that is stuck within that time. For example, the name of the show, Over the Garden Wall, is a reference to the 1919 film of the same name. This film isn't part of classic American media history because it's a lost media. It's gone, no one will ever see it or know more about it than we already do. And this is very in line with Over the Garden Wall's idea of the unknown. It's a land that exists between reality and fantasy, between life and death. It's like Schrodinger's cat in the way that lost media is. It being lost means it only exists partially. The unknown is a liminal space where it's unclear what it is exactly and what's happening, but we know that it's between existing and not. Just as lost media is, it only exists in so much of it that we remember. And references like this are so easy to miss because the show itself creates an explanation for the title. They end up in the unknown because Greg and Wirt go over a wall into the Eternal Garden from the cemetery in episode 9. But the show directly references this movie before this explanation happens. The Lost film has this title because it's about a man and a woman who fall in love after seeing each other over a garden wall. And the man is really wealthy, so it's possible this is kind of referenced in episode 5 with Endicott and his love interest. But I think a more overt reference is the song of the same name, Over the Garden Wall, in episode 6. It tells the love story of this lonely person who sings into a lake, and the stream carries his song over mountains and hilltops and a garden wall to someone. It's the song I played in this video. And part of the reasoning that I explained here is my interpretation, but the creator has confirmed that this movie is why this show is titled this. And also that Bessie Love, who was in the movie, is his favorite actress, and he clearly watched a lot of early 20th century / late 19th century media before making this show. because so much of it is referenced. The potatoes and molasses scene is almost a recreation of Animal Crackers in My Soup by Shirley Temple. Especially the way it ends, but even just how the seats are rowed and how the piano is being played. I will love to dive deeper into that and other references, but it's going to take quite a few videos, so buckle up. So Over the Garden Wall, this cute little show, is basically a retelling of Dante's Inferno. I'm not even close to the first person to say this, and if you've read Dante's Inferno and you see any episode of this show, then you will know that it's hard not to see it. This bird being named Beatrice and being like an introduction to the unknown is kind of your first hint that this is going to be Dante's Inferno, but it's so much more than that. So Wirt, aka Dante, is a love-struck artist and poet who goes through this creepy, hellish forest that exists outside of reality with his brother Greg, aka Virgil. Greg is the reason they're in the forest to begin with, and he leads Wirt even further and further by just jumping ahead and running towards whatever's next. Greg even refers to himself as the one leading them through the forest. Beatrice also helps guide them in a way, which is kind of like her being the guide in Dante's Paradiso. The Beast is so obviously Lucifer, it's not even questioned. He's literally called the Beast. He also has these evil little turtles that follow them subtly throughout the series. And he's not portrayed as evil for being just like this vicious creature or something. He's evil for being deceptive. He is the ultimate betrayer. Although the Edelwood trees might be the most obvious thematic reference to Dante's, in the Inferno, souls who committed suicide are doomed to be trees forever. And one of the major themes of the show is this question of giving up on life, either through death or through escapism, which, spoilers ahead, is represented by turning into the Edelwood trees. These trees are lost souls that are ground up and fed to the lantern. Now, even beyond this, some people have interpreted every episode as being a reference to a circle of hell. Episode 1 is The Gates of Hell, where the huntsman basically says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," fully warning them not to go further in fear of the beast. Episode 2 is the first circle of Limbo with the chill pumpkin village. Limbo in the Inferno is the space for people who were basically good people and not sinners, but were not baptized as babies, and therefore couldn't go to heaven. They get to just live in a chill village. I've seen people talk about the biblical connection here with the head of the pumpkin village being named Enoch, the ancestor of Noah. But in general, I don't think it's hard to see how this little village of skeletons in the middle of the unknown is a reference to the Limbo. The next circle is for people whose sin was lust, and the next episode centers around the relationship between the teacher and her lover, and all of the conflict happening arises because of their relationship. Next is Gluttony in the Tavern, which not only are the tavern people constantly gloating, but also they seem to be eating all of the food that is being brought to Greg's table. And as another direct reference to the Inferno, they refer to Wirt as a pilgrim. And they initially think his pilgrimage has to do with love, which it does in both the Inferno and in the actual story itself, as we come to find out later. Next is Greed in the story of Endicott, where these two crazy wealthy people fall in love, and our crew needs to steal change from Endicott. There's a lot of really interesting things happening in this episode actually because of this, but I'll talk about that in another video because it's going to be way too long. But their money is what causes these characters to be together and simultaneously be apart. And the fact that they're business rivals, like the next episode/circle is where these parallels start to become much more direct. So even though Dante doesn't have to pay a fare to cross the river Styx, classically you have to pay in coins. 2 coins were placed over the eyes of dead people in order to pay the ferryman to cross the river Styx in classic Greek mythology. And in Over the Garden Wall, they had to steal 2 coins from Endicott in the previous episode so that they could pay for this ferry. This circle is anger, and there are a lot of pieces where that might fit. This is where we see the first, legitimate antagonist, and real conflict starts to arise between the characters. But not only is the ferry and the river being referenced here, but also the punishment of the sinners is to be stuck in mud, and at the end of the ferry, the frogs roll around in mud. Oh, and the string at Adelaide's is a reference to the Fates. before Dante enters the city of Dis. The next circle is heresy, which has an emphasis on witchcraft, and in the episode, it's two Puritan aesthetic characters, and there's clearly a lot of witch imagery happening, where we find out where the Edeltrees come from, being people who've given up on life and theoretically committed suicide. And it's paralleling the same circle in Dante's, which is violence, particularly violence against self. There's also a fight that happens between Greg and the North Wind, which is a very interesting scene that we will talk about at some point. The next circle is fraud, and the episode is the backstory of what happened before all of this, where Wirt is clearly putting on a facade of himself and thinking he has to do that in order to impress Sarah. Constantly comparing himself to other people and just in general being worried about just being who he is. The last circle, treachery, parallels the last episode. They confront the beast, just like Dante does. Greg is covered in the Edelwood branches and snow as his soul is being consumed, just like the souls in this level being covered in ice. The beast's treachery is also revealed here, and Beatrice's treachery is forgiven. Also, even though Greg is the more Virgil character, Beatrice shares this role to a degree, and she's the character left behind at the end. Which could be a reference to Virgil being left behind at the end of Inferno, or Beatrice herself, the character, being left behind at the end of the comedy. They leave the unknown in this episode just as Dante leaves the Inferno, and Wirt has grown significantly as a person because of this experience. It's arguable that Greg has too, but the story isn't really about Greg as much as it is about Wirt, at least in terms of development. Wirt is at a low point in his life. He is the most susceptible to the unknown, just as Dante is at a low point in his life and is most susceptible to the Inferno. And this experience was created specifically in order for him to overcome it. There are probably even more parallels than this to the Inferno. It's very clearly a source material. It lines up really well with the story, and some of the references are pretty direct. But yeah, like I said, this is a really popular interpretation of this show, and it's hard not to agree with it. And I think this show makes for a very fascinating way to parallel the Inferno and subvert it in some ways. Okay, I am so excited to talk about this because this is almost the first thing I mentioned when talking about historical references in Over the Garden Wall. So as this commenter says, Babes in the Woods is an old nursery rhyme about two kids who go into the woods and die. But something interesting about this is in the nursery rhyme, after the kids die, robins come and cover them in leaves. And this is how the boys go to sleep in the episode Babes in the Woods. And in this same episode, Greg also meets the Queen of the Clouds, who has birds circling around her head, and he makes a deal with her to save Wirt from the beast by trading places with him. Which is interesting since it also connects this to the popular usage of the phrase babes in the woods as an idiom, meaning innocently going into a situation unaware of the danger that's there. Greg's dream appears to be a nice place, and the Queen of the Clouds appears to be a benefactor, but Greg ends up making a deal to trade his life with her. And he ends up going with the beast into who knows where. Also interesting about this is that this show pulls a lot from 19th and 20th century aesthetics, this episode in particular having a notable difference in the stylistic choices made in the rest of the show and in Greg's dream. His dream seems to be rooted in like a mid-20th century animation aesthetic, an aesthetic that was very similar to theatrical pantomimes, which were slapstick musical comedies with a lot of gags and dancing. The dream sequence has a very similar vibe to it, even with like the fight that North Wind and Greg have. And one of the most popular pantomimes in the 19th and 20th century was Babes in the Woods. See, what's really interesting to me about the Queen of the Clouds is that she seems to be a heavenly character. She's in the clouds, she has cherubs, she's here to grant Greg's wish, her introduction is very angelic. And it is possible to read her that way. But what I think is strange about her is when Greg wants to go home, she assumes he means only himself. And then when he goes on to say, oh, him and Wirt, she says, oh, Wirt can't come because he's already taken in by the beast. And so Greg wishes to take Wirt's place. This makes a lot of sense for Greg's character. He feels he needs to protect his brother. And the show is really heavy on this theme of siblings protecting each other. Greg thinks of himself as a failure for not leading them out of the forest, which I think is also what allows him to be susceptible to the beast in this moment. So this scene in general makes perfect sense when it comes to Greg. What's interesting, and I would say suspicious to me about the Queen of the Clouds, is that how could she make this deal with Greg to trade his soul for Wirt's instead of just saving Wirt herself? I think the implication could be that she's just not as powerful as the Beast or is on like an equal footing to him. But I think her lack of concern for Wirt to begin with is a hint at the possibility that she's not actually what she seems to be. Deception is a very common theme of this show. And if you notice, every single character who appears to be villainous when we first meet them, besides the Beast, is not actually so. The dog at the beginning is just trying to eat candy. He's not actually trying to eat the kids. Auntie Whispers appears stereotypically evil, but is actually just a sweet old lady. But all of the characters who do cause harm to the boys, besides the Beast again, are characters who appear to be friendly at first. Beatrice, Lorna, and Adelaide. Of course, it's just the spirit inside Lorna that's an antagonist, and Beatrice regrets her choices. But all of these characters do have intention to cause harm to the boys at one point, unlike all of the characters that they think have intention to cause harm to them. But there is another character who actually puts the boys in danger, at least Greg specifically, and that is the Queen of the Clouds. It appears to be Greg's choice to switch places with Wirt, but is it really? Or is he simply manipulated into this? I think the Queen of the Clouds is definitely invoking the image of God, and it's possible that's who she's meant to represent, but it's also possible that she's actually the Beast in disguise. This fits in line with the title being Babes in the Wood, where Greg goes into a place that he doesn't realize is actually dangerous for him, i.e. the Queen of the Clouds space. It also explains why she doesn't mention Wirt to begin with. She's trying to get Greg to mention it himself. See, the Beast wants you to believe that when you make a decision that he wants you to make, it's in your best interest to do so. That's part of the evil of the Beast. He doesn't outright attack anybody. He doesn't force anyone to do something directly. He manipulates people into giving up on life so that they can turn into Edelwood trees. And he manipulates the huntsman into feeding the lantern that holds his soul. Even if he isn't the Queen in the Clouds directly facilitating this manipulation, I can't help but feel like he has some sort of involvement in it, and that there's something suspicious going on between these characters. Although if anybody else has another interpretation of her, I would love to read it. Also, quite a few people mentioned that this dream sequence references Alice's Wonderland, which is an old silent film made by Disney in the 1920s. I'm not entirely sure the Queen of the Clouds' relationship to this, however, I do think it's possible and likely that there's some connection there as well. Okay, so let's talk about how Greg is both fulfilling and subverting the role that Virgil has in Dante's Inferno. Because the thing about Over the Garden Wall is that it parallels Dante's Inferno, but it's still telling its own story. And in doing so, it creates a role for its Virgil-esque character that never existed in the original Inferno. But before we get to that subversion, let's talk about the ways in which Greg parallels Virgil. The first way is being a companion to an obviously Dante character. The parallels between Wirt and Dante are a lot more obvious than Greg and Virgil, because Wirt has pretty much the same personality and interests as Dante. But not only is Greg Wirt's companion through this journey, but he is also the one leading them, and protecting Wirt in the process. Virgil not only leads Dante through hell, but he protects him from various beings that would do Dante harm if Virgil wasn't there. We see Greg fulfilling the same role of protecting his brother from the dangers of the unknown. In episode 1, he gets rid of the dog demon by throwing the candy that's on Wirt. He saves them from the demon possessing Lorna, and he sacrifices himself to the Beast, offering to take Wirt's place. And he does this specifically because he thinks he was the one who was supposed to lead them out of the unknown, and he feels like he failed Wirt, which he says in episode 8. Greg is also the one who saves Beatrice from the bush, and Virgil was tasked by Beatrice to bring Dante through hell. Another parallel to Virgil is Greg's affinity for music and poetry. And this is also where things start to get interesting and subversive. Greg is a very musical character, he sings a bunch, and he plays the drums on himself. And even though Wirt is the one spouting poetry throughout most of the series, Greg has his own little poem that he says right before they go to sleep in episode 8. And the big difference between this poem and these songs and Virgil's work is that Greg's are very silly. And in general, that's the big difference between Greg and Virgil. Greg is silly and fun-loving, while Virgil is a lot more sober and serious. Although still a lot more upbeat than the melancholic Dante. But what's interesting when it comes to these pairs' parallel of poetry is that Dante is inspired by Virgil. Like before the Inferno, Virgil is a poetic hero to Dante. But here, Greg is inspired by Wirt. Greg's poem and his musical interests come from an admiration for his musician brother, who's constantly talking in poems. This show is very interested in examining this sibling relationship and who is responsible for who. Greg is constantly the one taking care of Wirt and feels responsible for him, despite Wirt being the older brother. And not only do we see this throughout the series, but Wirt even says this in episode 9 when he talks about Greg and Greg's father constantly trying to get Wirt to join marching band and make more friends. And in episode 1, the huntsman calls Wirt out on this behavior, that he is the older brother and he's the one that should be responsible for Greg. And this is something Wirt continuously fails at, in part because he is resentful towards Greg. Or probably more especially Greg's father, who is Wirt's stepdad. And even though Wirt, like Greg, thinks that he's taking care of his brother, Greg is the one actually doing this until the very end. And this conflict of who is responsible for who is where the show ends up subverting the relationship between their Dante and Virgil-esque characters. Because in the end, Wirt's confrontation with the beast is him finally taking on the role to protect his brother, as the huntsman told him to do in episode 1. In a lot of ways, Greg views himself as their guide through the unknown, as their Virgil, but in the end, Wirt takes up this role himself. And poetically, musically, Wirt was always the Virgil to Greg. He was his inspiration, because Greg has always loved and admired his older brother. So yeah, through most of the story, there is a parallel narrative to Dante's Inferno where Greg fills the role that Virgil does. Even though there appears to be a lot of differences between the characters outside of this role, such as their personality. But even that enables it to create this subversion in the end, where Wirt becomes Greg's savior. Also worth noting here that the story is pulling from a lot more inspiration than just Dante's Inferno, so there are a lot of other tropes and roles that both Greg and Wirt are fulfilling throughout the series at various points. But these parallels to the Inferno are a big one. Okay, so I've talked a bit about some of the references that Over the Garden Wall is making, but today I want to talk about my personal interpretation of this show. There are a lot of themes this show is discussing and a lot of different interpretations you can have of it. But for me, the main thing this show is discussing is whether or not to give up on life. Or if you want to be less dark, whether to give up on doing things just because they frighten us. Although I think it's significantly easier to get to the darker conclusion. Now we know this entire story is being told while the boys are drowning in a lake. And there is constant drowning imagery throughout the show. In episode 1, they fall off the roof into water and Wirt comes up gasping for breath. We see imagery of sinking when Greg throws Endicott's coins into the well. Wirt literally falls through the ice at the end of episode 8 into a frozen lake. And some people have read parts of the blurred intro in episode 1 as being told as if you're underwater. And on top of that imagery, in almost every episode, the boys are told they should stay in the unknown, or are presented with the option or possibility to do so. In episode 1, the huntsman tells them to stay put and not go further in. In episode 2, Enoch offers them to stay in Pottsfield. They could stay at the school, the tavern, Endicott's. Beatrice even convinces Wirt to stay in episode 6 before he sees her at Adelaide's. And Adelaide herself is even trying to get them to stay. Although I wouldn't focus too much on Adelaide's desire for this, because in all other instances, it's the boys' choice whether to stay or not. And I think that's the main focus. In episode 8, Greg makes a deal with the Queen of the Clouds to stay in place of Wirt. And in episode 10, not only does Wirt save Greg from the Idlewood tree that's growing around him, but he also saves Greg from drowning because Wirt is the only one who wakes up in the lake. And I think that's specifically because Greg was choosing to stay and Wirt was not. And that was the fear the whole time, as whether or not Wirt was going to choose to stay, aka to choose to drown. That's what turning into the Idlewood tree would have done. And Wirt saves Greg from this by saving him from the Idlewood tree, and then later by saving him from drowning altogether. And somebody said they read somewhere that the creator had originally planned on having one of the boys die, but Cartoon Network wouldn't allow that. Whether or not that's true, I think if one of these boys was going to die, it would be Greg. because Wirt is the one contemplating his existence the whole time, and Greg is the one continuously saving him. And I think Greg's sacrifice in the end is what saves Wirt altogether. Greg saved Wirt from himself, from his contemplation of his own existence. I actually think that's part of what's great about Greg living in the end, is that it shows Wirt's growth, and how Greg saving Wirt from himself ultimately saves Greg. Wirt needed to get over his own personal contemplations of life, and also his resentment towards Greg and Greg's dad, which is what saves Greg in the end. At least this is my biggest takeaway from the story. I have seen some interpretations that the boys did die in the end, which I think is interesting, and there's a lot of different directions you could go with some of these interpretations. But for me, I like to think of the whole experience taking place within their drowning, and in the end, there being a final moment of Wirt finally accepting Greg's help, which ultimately allows Wirt to save Greg. Through this interpretation, the beast is also like intrusive thoughts. He's trying to convince you to give up, to stay in the unknown. And he's very manipulative in doing so, using your own feelings against you. Sarah also is representative of Wirt's insecurity. A really cool thing about Over the Garden Wall is how it was able to pay homage to a lot of the things that it was referencing, while still creating something unique and special on its own. For example, Potatoes and Molasses being a very iconic song from the show, but it paying direct homage to Animal Crackers in My Soup. It just does it subtly enough that it's still unique. And we can see that by looking at the end scene of each song.
Like a fisherman's barge, you know you're eating that when you start seeing stuff. Oh, potatoes and molasses. It's the only thing left on your tusk. Quest they're short and stout to make everyone shout for potatoes and molasses. For potatoes and...
That's enough!
Father?
Is this what I've been paying for?
Hey, we just wanted to have a little fun.
I didn't invest in this school for fun. I thought we were trying to do important work here, teaching animals to count and spell.
When they're inside me wearing dress, I walk around like Noah's Ark. I stuff my tummy like a goop when animal crackers in my soup. Oh my goodness.
Singing in the dining room. Madam, is this the kind of manners you teach them?
Okay, so let's finally address what is probably the biggest question that I've gotten asked since I started making videos about Over the Garden Wall, and that is, what the hell are these black turtles? If you don't remember these turtles, here's a quick rundown of their appearances. They first appear in episode 1 when Greg sees one and puts a piece of candy on it. Later in the same episode, they get attacked by this dog beast, who is after their candy, and at the end of the episode, he coughs up one of these black turtles and turns back into a normal dog. Presumably the same black turtle that Greg gave the candy to begin with. Their next appearance is in episode 3, kind of in the background. While Greg is talking to the school farm animals, this turtle is crossing a log and the raccoon picks it up and throws it into the water. Then in episode 4, the Woodsman watches one of the turtles crawling away. In episode 7, we see the second and final major appearance of the turtles. In this episode, a character named Auntie Whispers appears to be an evil witch-type character, but it turns out her niece is possessed by a demon and Auntie Whispers is just trying to help her. At least it appears that way. We're going to put a little pin in Auntie Whispers' motivations and come back to that later. Anyways, at some point when the boys still think that she's going to be the villain of the episode, she eats some of these black turtles. Now, unlike the dog, Auntie Whispers doesn't appear to transform after eating the turtle, but it's worth noting that she looks like this, along with like black-gray gums, which I think is worth pointing out because the eyes of the dog here share some similarities. Also, this is what her niece looks like, and this is what her sister looks like, who succeeds in looking evil while still looking human. There's a huge contrast between Lorna and Adelaide's appearance and Auntie Whispers. Anyways, back to the turtles. There are 3 more minor appearances, although one of them is very interesting. We see this turtle in Greg's dream in episode 8. Probably their most interesting appearance happens in episode 9, where we see a poster for a band called the Black Turtles in Wirt's room in the real world. And their final appearance is at the very end of the show, where the fishing fish reels one in. Now, despite all of these appearances of the turtles and their direct involvement in the plot, the show never tells us what they are. And this is by design. The creator has said that they are an intentional mystery. But just because they're intentionally ambiguous doesn't mean we can't attempt an interpretation of what they might be. However, it does mean there are a lot of things that these turtles might be. Now let's start with the more simple textual literary analysis and work our way out into the more complex and mythological possibilities. The simplest interpretation, kind of based off what the creator has said, is that they are the unknown of the unknown. They are themselves the embodiment of ambiguity and imperfection, and we'll never understand them because they are unknowable. While this does make sense, it leaves out a lot of what makes the turtles interesting, and their potential to say something much deeper about the story. Now the next interpretation, and I would say probably the one that makes the most sense, is that they have some kind of connection to the beast. Either he controls them or they created him. By extension, they represent whatever the beast represents. Whether that be the devil or the embodiment of evil or the embodiment of giving up on life. When you're looking at the story as paralleling Dante's Inferno, this is a really good interpretation to go with. The turtles are effectively the shadowy figures of Lucifer watching the travelers. The beast also shares his eyes with this dog, and Auntie Whisper's eyes are suspiciously yellow and big, unlike her sister or her niece. If the essence of the beast or something like that are in these turtles, then it might make sense why they would affect these characters this way, and other characters would be adverse to them, such as the raccoon throwing one. But how come the dog turns into a beast-like figure while Auntie Whispers appears to be fine? This is at the heart of this comment's question and many others about the turtles. But as I've been hinting at throughout the video, I don't think Auntie Whispers is actually fine. And I do think the turtles are why. We've already talked about how her appearance is very different than her family's, but she also has a complicated morality. So when we find out that her niece Lorna is possessed by a demon, we assume that Auntie Whispers must be a good guy, because she's actually been trying to keep people safe from Lorna by controlling her with this bell. But at the end of the episode, we find out that the bell has the power to free her from the demon, and Auntie Whispers is sad when Lorna is freed from the demon because she fears that Lorna won't want to be with her anymore. Which suspiciously makes it seem like Auntie Whispers knew the whole time that she could have freed Lorna and was just allowing this demon to possess her so that she could be around her niece all the time. And while that's still significantly better than the children-eating witch that Greg and Wirt assumed that she would be at the beginning, that's still a pretty messed up thing for her to have done. But I think her doing this is a side effect from her eating the turtles. This manipulation of Lorna is very similar to how the beast manipulates characters. And I think what eating the turtles actually does is give you some qualities of the beast, particularly in regards to a feeling of need. The dog needs the candy, Auntie Whispers needs Lorna, and the beast needs Edelwood. I also suspect that Auntie Whispers is likely in a cycle when it comes to eating the turtles, because we see that she's actually highly concerned with protecting others. Despite manipulating Lorna, she is trying to protect people from Lorna's demon. And she does genuinely care about Lorna and her well-being and her safety. She also warns the boys about her sister Adelaide. I wonder if her eating the turtles has something to do with this. Perhaps there's no other way to get rid of the turtles. In which case she eats them and mitigates their effects on herself by being magic, like her sister. But they still affect her appearance and some of her personality, probably unknowingly. In this way, the turtles are kind of a hidden danger. They're really in line with the show's theme of things are not always as they appear. These little turtles are significantly more dangerous than they seem. So that's what they mean, right? They're a connection to a lot of the show's themes. They're avatars of the beast in some way, and that morphs the reality of the things that consume them. Although you could also argue that you just have to be around the turtles, not even fully consume them. But either way, they're this kind of symbolic creature. And this connects them to Dante's Inferno in some way, right? Well, there is another major classic story that Over the Garden Wall parallels and references frequently. And that story is The Wizard of Oz. And also kind of Alice in Wonderland, but we're talking about Wizard of Oz right now. I actually don't see people talk about the show's connection to The Wizard of Oz very often. But the turtles are what made me start looking into it. And I will do a separate video talking more about Over the Garden Wall's connection to this story, but for now let's stick to what the turtles have to do with it. Well, if you notice, there's one appearance of the turtles that has nothing really to do with our other interpretation, and that is the turtles in Wirt's room. As I'm sure you know, the characters of Oz parallel characters in Dorothy's real life, and at the end, when she returns home from Oz, she wakes up as if having been dreaming the whole thing, and she points to all the characters and are like, you were there, etc. Now, I will note, I don't think it makes sense to interpret Over the Garden Wall as a dream. After all, Greg and Wirt both share the experience, and it would diminish a lot of the other interpretations. However, Dorothy's experience is also not necessarily a dream, and there have been many popular interpretations and adaptations of The Wizard of Oz where it's clearly not a dream. It's simply that elements of her real life are intermingled with Oz, and we see a similar thing happening in this episode of Over the Garden Wall. Like I said, we'll talk about the non-turtle elements in a different episode, but how this relates to the turtles, the fact that this poster even exists is already crazy because black turtles are such a specific thing. But also this poster is a black turtle with 4 people inside of it. Kind of like the 4 characters of Wizard of Oz, but also you could see this as being the 4 characters that become captured by the turtle, aka the Beast. I imagine people would have differing opinions on who these 4 characters are because there are kind of 6 to choose from. Obviously, there's Greg and Wirt, and if you fully go into the Oz illusion, then you can interpret this as being all 4 of the traveling characters. Wirt, Greg, Beatrice, and the Frog. That probably makes the most sense, although Beatrice and the Frog actually don't have anything to do with the Beast other than their connections to Greg and Wirt. But there are still 4 characters that are directly affected by the Beast, which is Greg, Wirt, the Woodsman, and the Woodsman's daughter. Either way, I like to think that this poster is like 4 characters who are captured by the turtles. Now, if we want to interpret the actual turtles in the unknown as relating to Oz, they play a very similar role to the flying monkeys. Obviously, it's not a perfect parallel because Adelaide, not the Beast, melts like the Wicked Witch. But there's still an interesting comparison and possible allusion to be made between the turtles and the flying monkeys. The monkeys have black fur and wear blue. It's unknown why they serve the big bad, in the movie at least, which is likely where Over the Garden Wall pulls any of its Oz references from. Their origins are unclear, and they're just kind of a malevolent force for the big bad to take advantage of. Although, to be honest, I think it only really makes sense to interpret the turtles this way in episode 9, and then read the turtles in the actual unknown in the other way. But there is an argument for the winged monkeys, it's just a pretty weak one. Anyways, I don't have time to get into the turtle mythology and color symbolism that could be happening here, so I guess I'll have a part 2 where I talk about that. Also, you likely noticed this video is a lot more speculation than mine tend to be, and there are many other interpretations of the turtles. It's hard not to speculate because they're so ambiguous, but I'd love to hear any other interpretations. So this comment reads, I'd love a video where you explain how this impacts your perception of the show. Does it enrich the show for you? Is it just texture/Easter eggs? This comment is in reference to my video about the parallels between Dante's Inferno and Over the Garden Wall, but I'm going to expand it a bit because my answer kind of applies to almost all media, which is that I find pretty much any retelling or allusion to classical literature to be enriching for that media. Not just classical literature either, but history or even some contemporary references. Part of the reason for this is honestly that it's just fun to notice these things and to see how this story interacts with stories that came before it. But I think the most interesting part of these stories is how it allows us to see the differences more clearly, and that can enhance and influence how we interpret the text. For example, going back to the Inferno and Over the Garden Wall, both Dante and Wirt's souls are at stake. Dante's at risk of losing his soul to the Inferno, while Wirt is at risk of losing himself to the unknown or the Beast. In this way, the stories parallel each other. But a key difference is the personal growth that the characters go through in order to solve their problem. Dante's growth is a spiritual one. It centers around understanding divine justice. He slowly loses his sympathy for the sinners of the Inferno as time goes on, as he develops an understanding that they deserve to be there. In the Inferno alone, this is kind of an ambiguous development, where it's unclear if this is just Dante's way of self-preservation from the psychological trauma of witnessing all of these punishments, or from a broader theme of salvation through God. And while the rest of the story goes on, the latter appears to be the case. Although we should put a pin in the rest of the Divine Comedy for another time and just focus on the Inferno for now. The point is, personal fulfillment for Dante eventually comes through faith, and a distancing of himself from the sinners of the Inferno. Wirt, on the other hand, has a journey of self-fulfillment through his brother, and learning to understand the responsibility that he has for his brother, and also that his brother is helping him. Before they go into the unknown, Wirt blames Greg and Greg's dad for ruining his life. But by the end of episode 9, when he's leaving Beatrice's family's nest, he acknowledges that he's the one who's been a bad brother. There's also a level of self-determination, acceptance of help, and not giving up on life when it's not working for you. Wirt and Dante go through a very similar journey, but Dante experiences very little development throughout it, and what appears to be the main growth he experiences is this understanding of divine justice. Wirt, on the other hand, is massively changed by his experience in the unknown, and a lot of his self-fulfillment is through empathy, through the relationship to his brother, and even the relationship to Beatrice. And the fact that it's so easy to see the parallels in their journeys really highlights this difference. And it gives you a deeper understanding of what's happening in both stories, why they're being told, what they're trying to say, and how they further interact with each other. And I'm saying both because it's not just Over the Garden Wall that gets enriched by this parallel, but it's very easy to read Dante's Inferno and never think about the character development because there's very little happening. So a story like Over the Garden Wall paralleling Dante's Inferno makes you interact with the text differently. It makes you think about aspects of it that you weren't noticing before. And it's not like the Inferno doesn't make sense for being this way. It's the beginning of a trilogy. We're not going to get into the rest of the Divine Comedy, but there's more that happens afterwards. But it's still really interesting to think about where Dante's at before and after the Inferno in a similar way of thinking of where Wirt's at before and after the unknown. Anyways, for me, that's why I find this kind of thing to be really enriching for a text in almost any media. All texts are influenced by the media that came before them. But when it's being done intentionally, or what seems to be intentional, you can find a lot of interesting things. I'm not a huge fan of the word try in this comment. It feels like it's intended as a challenge to the interpretation of Over the Garden Wall I was talking about in that video as a parallel to Dante's Inferno, implying that these characters are Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith and Knight of Infinite Resignation rather than Dante and Virgil. Here's the thing, we're talking about metaphors, allusions, tropes, and the reality is multiple interpretations of a show can be equally valid. It does not always have to be this or that. It can be both. And perhaps the commenter didn't mean it this way, but what's interesting to me about this comment is that if there is only one interpretation of this show, it is certainly not the Knight of Faith and the Knight of Infinite Resignation. PBS Idea Channel did a video comparing these characters to Kierkegaard's knights, and that seems to be where this interpretation comes from, but even in that video they point out some of the ways where these characters don't line up perfectly with these knights. Which I'll explain what these knights are and what this means in a moment, but I think the interpretation of these characters through this lens is really interesting and can say a lot about our contemporary ideas on religion. I just think the comparison to these knights is more surface level than people may think, which is okay, not every metaphor has to fit everything perfectly. But I really don't like when people say your interpretation is incorrect, here is an alternative one, when that alternative is a weaker interpretation. Totally down to be challenged on any interpretation I talk about in my videos, but remember that multiple interpretations of a work can exist, and if you are going to try and say there's only one, make sure you understand where that one is coming from. Because as I said before, there are issues with this interpretation. So what are Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith and Knight of Infinite Resignation? On a very surface level, it is an ultimate optimist and an ultimate pessimist. The Knight of Faith, aka Greg here, essentially says, in the face of the absurd, I can still do anything through my faith in God. With God, anything is possible. And through this faith, they are able to make the impossible happen. Things just work out, even if it doesn't make sense for them to. The Knight of Infinite Resignation, aka Wirt, has the opposite situation. The Knight of Infinite Resignation will have doubts about something, make a half-hearted attempt at it, fail, and then give up. And then wax poetically about how it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. You can see where these characters fit into these general archetypes. Wirt doesn't believe in himself, so that he is therefore doomed to fail because he never really tries to begin with. And Greg is able to just do things because he believes that they'll just work out. However, there are quite a few issues with Greg being the Knight of Faith. The first, which is pointed out in that PBS Idea Channel video, is that the Knight of Faith is actually supposed to experience resignation first. He goes through a very similar process to the Knight of Infinite Resignation. His resignation is just not infinite. He will eventually continue to try through his faith in God, and that's how things will ultimately work out. This is not how Greg behaves through most of the show. He doesn't experience resignation except maybe a bit in episode 8, and he's not really believing in some kind of ultimate power that something will work out. His optimism seems to come directly from the fact that he is a child and not in the pessimistic adolescent stage that Wirt is in. He often seems to just not know to be afraid. And we could still interpret this as having faith that things will just work out, but it's not through any kind of external force, and it's not even really through himself. He just isn't at the developmental stage where he can fully process the consequences of his actions. And as I said in my last video, there are a lot of interesting differences that can be highlighted from comparing these works, and I do think that this is an interesting interpretation. I just think that there's a bit more to it than just simply saying that these two are the knights. I also really simplified my explanation of the Knight of Infinite Resignation. In general, the concept of these knights is more complicated than that. There's an idea that they concentrate their entire existence into their one desire, and the Knight of Faith eventually gets it, while the Knight of Resignation experiences peace and rest, knowing that they'll never experience what they want, and learning to be okay with that. But not everything has to be a perfect metaphor or interpretation. Sometimes it's simply enough to discuss how these characters resemble or don't resemble the knights. That's the fun in literary analysis.
Question. What are 2 things that you did not realize were done by the same person?
Come up to the lab and see what's on the slab. I see you shiver with anticipation.
Welcome home, Auntie.
Your Honor, my sweet child. Has anyone come here today?
Nay, Auntie, not a soul.
Then no one shall be devoured alive tonight.
Nay, I pray not, Mum.
So besides Dante's Inferno, I think the media that Over the Garden Wall pulls from the most is Wizard of Oz. The unknown is this kind of liminal space that often gets compared to the afterlife or some kind of purgatory, and I think it's very comparable to Oz. Of course, this liminal space is also invoking the Inferno, Wonderland, and a lot of classic fairy tales that take place in some strange forest, but I think that there's something unique about its comparison to Oz. The biggest probably being the way we view the unknown is influenced by Wirt's real life, just like the way we view Oz is influenced by Dorothy's real life. When Dorothy leaves Oz, she points out how all the people in her real life seem to have been there, as the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion, etc. Similarly, aspects of Wirt's reality are seen throughout the unknown, including black turtles, which he has a poster of in his room. He meets a man named Quincy Endicott, whose grave was in the cemetery they were in before going into the unknown, and the entire story is told in this kind of vintage style that fits really well with what seems to be Wirt's interests. After all, he was able to recognize the design of this mansion as French Rococo style. This fits in line with the idea that the unknown we see is Wirt's unknown, or at least we're seeing it through his perception. There's a great video essay that I'll include the link to that mentioned this idea, that what we're seeing is the unknown filtered through Wirt. And the dream Greg has in episode 8 is an example of what the unknown would look like if it was through his eyes. Or if it was his unknown specifically, depending on how the unknown manifests. Anyways, back to the Wizard of Oz. I think something interesting this comment points out is that Oz is a real place in the books. And we get a hint that the unknown is a real place despite all of the fantastical and afterlife-seeming aspects to it. Which is that in the real world, the frog still glows from having swallowed the bell in the unknown. This creates a lot of interesting implications to the connection between the unknown and the real world. As you can see, all of these kids can also see the bell. You'll also notice that unlike other hero's journey type stories, all of these stories of entering an otherworldly place and going on this kind of journey, especially for a character like Wirt, is a lot more about personal development and growth. And in the end, coming out with your perspective changed. Dorothy and Wirt both having grown to appreciate the people in their real lives more. Also, on top of how this seems to pull from Wizard of Oz, there are a few direct references made to it, and I'd just like to share them with you for fun for a moment. Adelaide melting is obviously a reference to the Wicked Witch's death. It's also apparently implied in the book that not only do Wicked Witches melt because of water, but they also do melt because of night air. Possibly being a reference to the concept of miasma being a toxic gas. that wasn't real but people thought existed and used to explain all kinds of illnesses. These guys from Greg's dream are the Lollipop Guild, and the Queen of the Clouds introduction seems to invoke very similar imagery to Glinda the Good Witch's introduction. There are probably other references as well, those are just a few I noticed, but I think that the connection between Oz and the unknown is what's especially interesting. I love seeing more examples of how Over the Garden Wall referenced classic American media, because there's just so many and a lot of them are incredibly subtle. Like the Tavern Keeper being visually and vocally based on Betty Boop is something you may have caught, but the Highwayman's dance referencing Coco the Clown is incredibly specific.
I'll knock you out, drag you off the road, steal your shoes from off your feet, and then Highwayman, when I make it.
She will search this wide world over, but she never find another sweet man like me. Now when I dive back in my straight leg breeches, put on a box back coat and a Stetson hat.
Let's talk about the Edelwood trees in Over the Garden Wall, because while it does sound nice to be a tree, you really don't want to be turned into one in this show. Or especially in the Inferno for that matter. Because in both stories, your fate goes beyond simply being turned into a tree when giving up on life. Edelwood trees, which used to be people, get ground into oil that feeds the Beast Lantern. And at some point during this process, your soul ends up at the Dark Lantern Tavern. And it seems like you simply become an archetype of who you used to be. This sounds like a fan theory, but it actually comes from Over the Garden Wall's Artbook. The tavern residents aren't able to leave the building, and their souls are connected to an Edelwood tree outside of it with multiple faces. This is the ultimate fate for people who lose to the Beast. You're trapped in this tavern forever, having lost most of who you are, only retaining one singular identity. None of these characters have an actual name, simply a profession that encompasses their entire identity. Trees in the Inferno have it even worse. They can feel pain and even bleed, and they're constantly being picked at, I think, by furies or harpies. Either way, the simple explanation of being turned into a tree does sound significantly nicer than what either of these stories have, which I think is on purpose. On the surface, being turned into a tree doesn't actually sound too bad, especially if you already are giving up on life. It can appear as almost a comforting out. And there is this sense of just giving in to being turned into this tree for both Wirt and Greg. Part of the manipulation of the Beast in this regard is that you're not told where your soul will end up after being turned into this tree, because you're going to end up losing a lot more than just your body. It's such a dark and haunting way to think about trees, and that kind of haunting feeling is something that Over the Garden Wall excels at. So at the very end of Over the Garden Wall's episode 4, Wirt and Greg run into this spooky tree and comment on how creepy it is, and then accidentally set fire to it with the Woodsman. This tree, according to Over the Garden Wall's Artbook, is actually the tavern guests. Here's the direct quote from the Artbook. The tree in this episode has a lot of faces on it. I thought at first it could have been Civil War soldiers that had fallen asleep by the tree. But it got wrapped into this idea that all the people in the tavern are actually in this tree. That's where they all died. If you watch, they don't actually leave the tavern. It's called the Dark Lantern, and that's what this tavern is. The lantern that their souls are trapped in. This has a lot of interesting implications for what it means to be in the tavern, especially since we know where these Edel trees come from and what happens to them. Also worth noting is that this is the episode where we learn that the Beast turns people into Edelwood trees and then grinds them up into oil, because the tavern keeper tells Wirt and Greg this. The tavern people have no names, instead they go by their profession, and they're really hyper-fixated on these professions as being their entire identity. And unfortunately for many of them, this means they're not really able to do their job because they're trapped within this tavern. You'll also notice this still from the opening sequence and one again at the end sequence, where it seems like these are created by the toy maker since all of these characters are within the tavern. Now I will say something interesting about this is that despite the Dark Lantern's tree burning up, we still end up getting this scene at the end, implying that the death of that tree doesn't kill the people in the tavern, which makes sense since they're already dead. Although it's also possible that with the defeat of the Beast, the characters in the tavern have a different fate now, similar to the Woodsman's daughter. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this. It's also worth noting that a lot of the things we see in the unknown are affected by Wirt's perception and his past. And in some way, I think these tavern guests not only represent what happens to you if you give up in the unknown, but also the psychology that's happening within Wirt and his search for an identity. All of them have a single trait that their entire personality is built around, but they know what they are. Wirt does not, and that's a source of insecurity for him. He lacks the confidence in understanding himself the way these tavern guests do. Also, a final note in regards to the tree burning down, this is actually a very important moment for the Woodsman. He comes here specifically because he's running out of Edelwood. So this tree catching fire is actually really important in understanding his motivation as time goes on. He is getting increasingly more desperate for Edelwood, because he's running out of oil for the lantern which he thinks hosts his daughter's soul. But in reality, if you've seen the ending, you know that it actually hosts the beast's soul, which I think could be why the beast is so eager to turn Greg into an Edelwood. This tree burning down is a huge problem for the beast. I think it's really cool that this tree has so many elements to it and connects to so many different characters throughout the show. Very subtly, it's something that I honestly forgot about until I read the art book. But I'm curious your thoughts on it and similar subtleties happening. Let's talk about Wirt's outfit, because as with many things in this show, there's actually a lot that goes into it. Before we get to what the cloak is, let's talk about his shoes. You may or may not have noticed that he has mismatched shoes on. In the comic, we get an explanation for how this was just kind of a scatterbrained moment for him. He was rushing out the door and he accidentally put on the wrong shoes. I think it's symbolic of how scattered Wirt feels as a person. Every piece of this outfit comes from something different, and when the kids at school ask him if he's supposed to be a gnome, he says, I guess, I don't know. Because he's lost and he doesn't know who he is, so this outfit is reflective of that. Also, a little fun fact about his shoes is that there's apparently an old wives' tale that if your left shoe comes undone while you're walking, it's because someone is gossiping about you. And when his left shoe comes undone, it's while Beatrice is talking about how he's such a pushover. Also, in regards to his scatteredness, his cape has all 3 primary colors in it, and his entire outfit in terms of color is kind of all over the place. Unlike Greg, whose outfit only has a few colors and are all generally the same earthy vibe. Next, let's talk about his hat. Obviously, it doubles as a dunce cap during the school episode. It's also used to identify him as possibly being a gnome to his schoolmates, and the red coloring is likely a reference to Dante, who's wearing a red cap in the Inferno, which you can go through this comment to see a video talking more about that. There's also a reference to him possibly being a wizard because of this hat and cloak. I definitely think that this was his intention with this outfit, but as with many things, Wirt's intention is not the outcome, and I think that creates an additional source of insecurity for him. Now let's finally talk about the cloak. So as this commenter pointed out, many people believe that it's this World War II nurse's cape, and obviously it does look quite similar. The alternative is that it's a Civil War Union infantry outfit. This is the hat that came with the cape, and as you can see, it looks much closer to the Civil War hat. This bugle on the hat was specifically used for the infantry, so even if the cape comes from somewhere else, this hat is almost undeniably a infantry Civil War hat. Also interesting how this is the symbol and Wirt is a woodwind musician, and personally I think that this is the purpose of his outfit. He looks almost like he could be in marching band, which is something that Greg and his father have been encouraging Wirt to join. But he rejects the hat that would make him look even more so like he would be in marching band, and then he's insecure about the reactions that his peers have specifically to his hat by calling him a gnome. At least that's what I think is happening here. As far as the actual outfit goes, I think it's probably a combination of this Civil War uniform and this army nurse uniform. However, the show seems to be slightly more inspired by Civil War era rather than World War II era, the art book specifically mentioning Civil War soldiers in it. Also, this is probably nothing, but apparently prior to the Civil War, the US soldiers used to have both dark blue and gray in their uniforms, but the Civil War divided this between the Union and the Confederacy, with the Union being dark blue and the Confederacy being gray, which is kind of interesting considering his pants are gray here instead of being blue and more uniform with his cape. Again, probably nothing, but it could also be part of this scatteredness that he has. He's also such a worried, anxious character, wearing a blue cape that covers a red undertone. It makes it feel like he's kind of hiding part of himself. Those last 2 points are basically just speculative interpretation based off the colors he has on. Let me know what you guys think about this and if there's anything I missed. I think Wirt's design is really interesting and says a lot more about his character than it initially lets on. I love how a single line in Over the Garden Wall can affect people's entire interpretation of the show. A lot of people have wondered what the frog means when he says the loveliest lies of all in the opening and ending sequences. And at some point we're going to get into many common theories for this, but I just finally showed my boyfriend this show last week, and I want to share with you his theory around this line and its implication for the rest of the show. because I thought it was really interesting and I had never heard it before. And I'm sure this interpretation is somewhere on the internet, but I just hadn't seen it yet. And that's that the whole show is a fantastical way of retelling the events of episode 9. As we know, episode 9 takes place chronologically before episode 1 and explains how they ended up in the unknown. And we see many aspects of their real world in this episode that have been featured throughout the unknown. For example, this poster of black turtles in Wirt's room, 2 old cats being referenced outside of Sarah's party, and perhaps most noticeably, Quincy Endicott's grave. There's a lot more than these, and I plan on making a whole video about all of these aspects of episode 9. But what's notable for this story is how these elements could have been spun into a fantastical story or a lovely lie. This scene right here is a perfect example. Quincy Endicott's headstone is next to an unnamed headstone, just like Quincy's mansion was attached to another mansion, and both people living in them thought each other were ghosts. And that whole episode is revolved around trying to steal from Endicott, just like these two are planning on how they're going to steal the cassette tape back from Sarah. So it's not hard to see how this could be reframed into that episode. Another example is how Wirt yells at Greg right before they fall into the lake, just like Wirt yells at Greg right before he trades his soul to the beast and then Wirt falls into the frozen lake. Many people tend to read the lovely lie as being a lie about the unknown's existence or a lie about what happened afterwards, as in a lie about both boys surviving. But if we take the lie as the unknown's existence, then this becomes a really nice way of doing that. Perhaps this is the way that Greg retells the story. That would also explain why the very first scene of the show is Greg taking Old Lady Daniel's rock, and the very last scene is him returning it. He's telling this story from beginning to end. As I said, there are a lot of interesting interpretations of this line and the show in general, but I thought I'd share this one with you all because I thought it was really interesting and I wanted to see what you guys think. So something really upsetting about Over the Garden Wall is how the art book is almost impossible to find. It had such a limited run and the people who have copies of it don't want to sell them. So now it feels almost impossible to find. And even though I think it's great and entertaining to read, I would never recommend that people try to look for it online, on any kind of archive on the internet, or some other way of reading it. So good luck in your search, and I hope that you're able to find a copy. Let's talk about the Woodsman's daughter in Over the Garden Wall. She's one of the most interesting characters despite basically not being in the show at all. She's only seen very briefly in the epilogue here and the intro here, although her story gets heavily expanded on in the comics, which we'll get to. But first, I want to talk about her role in the animated series only, because the comics really change how we view and interpret the situation. All we really get in the show is that she was somehow taken by the beast in the past, and the Woodsman has been tricked for a long time into thinking that her soul was trapped in the lantern, and that's why he has to keep the fire lit. But in the end, we find out this was just a lie created by the beast to keep the Woodsman feeding the beast's soul, which is the Dark Lantern's light. The Woodsman's daughter creates a really interesting way for the show to talk about grief, loss, and false hope, and how far we might go to keep that false hope alive. How far is the Woodsman willing to go in believing the beast? I actually personally was conflicted with the Woodsman's daughter still being alive because I think it takes away a bit from this scene that's happening right here, when the Woodsman finally realizes that his daughter was never in the lantern to begin with. And he finally comes to terms with the possibility that she's gone forever. And he's only able to defeat the beast because he's given up this false hope and finally accepted this. That something that might feel impossible, the death of your child before you, might actually be true. And it makes you wonder if the lovely lie in the song that's playing over this scene is that his daughter is alive, and that he gets to see her again. And that fantasy is how he copes with the knowledge that he never will. But this is an interpretation that is exclusive to the show, because in the comic we see what actually happened to her. And we even get to learn that her name is Anna. Sometime after the death of the Woodsman's wife, Anna goes out into the woods to get some supplies, and she encounters the beast after cutting a tree that has black oil inside. The beast implies that he had been watching her, and then she runs back home. But after getting home, her father had already left in search of her. He finds her cloak near the beast, who lies and says that he's trapped her soul inside the lantern. The Woodsman never returns home and instead ends up living in the building we see in episode 1, while Anna stays at home waiting for him. And the ghost of her mother keeps her company in mirrors until he finally returns home. This really changes how we might view the Woodsman story. It takes away the possible tragedy of his story ultimately being just coping in grief, and instead shows how this coping actually prevented him from finding his daughter to begin with, which is his own kind of tragedy. If he simply had the emotional capacity to finally return home to his cabin, he would have found her there. But that also shows just how manipulative the Beast is. The Beast obviously knows that's where she'll be. He seems to have been watching her beforehand. He knew what her name was. And his guidance for the Woodsman towards Edelwood is what prevented him from going home, until the very end where the Woodsman defeated the Beast. For the Woodsman, the Beast seems to be a special kind of temptation. The Beast is constantly encouraging everyone else to give up on life. But for the Woodsman, he creates a sort of parasitic relationship. Giving up is the one thing that would actually free the Woodsman from the Beast and finally allow him to see his daughter again. But he's the person the Beast doesn't want to give up. It's a really interesting subversion of the helpfulness of hope that the rest of the series seems to have. And it's interesting considering that Anna herself is in the opposite situation. She never gives up on the idea that her dad will someday return, so she waits at home forever for him. And the reveal at the end of the show that she's still alive is a shock to both the audience and the Woodsman, but for Anna it's catharsis because she never gave up hope that he was still alive, and that he'd someday return. She's a very interesting character, and I would love to hear your thoughts about her. I think she's symbolic of a lot of the themes that Over the Garden Wall is trying to touch upon, especially in regard to hope and loss and dreams. It's really interesting how in the comic she sees the ghost of her mother. I think an interesting possibility that might be a little too far-fetched is that the Beast might actually be responsible for her seeing her mother, and that's why she stays at home and never goes searching for her father. And in that way, he's manipulating both of them from not seeing each other. But even without that, I think there's a lot of interesting things going on here. Also, just a random observation I made is that her nose is the same as Wirt's. This doesn't necessarily mean anything, but most other characters don't have Wirt's nose, including her father. In the end, I think the unknown is a sort of afterlife or between lives, and Anna and her father both represent unique ways of trying to cope with this, particularly how one might deal with their own inevitable death or the inevitable death of their family. But let me know what y'all think of Anna and her father, because I'm curious. Here's another fun classic media reference in Over the Garden Wall, this time featuring Greg's Frog. This one was really fun for me because it's a piece of classic media that I recognized. At least the first one I'll be talking about. The second reference I found out about through a YouTube video that I'll link. So the general premise of this frog, who acts like a frog but then randomly can sing, is a reference to the classic One Froggy Evening with Michigan J. Frog. It comes from around the same time that most other media Over the Garden Wall is referencing, and he's basically just a normal frog until he stands on two legs and starts singing, and then goes back to being a normal frog. It's a clear visual reference from when the frog sings for the first time. This seems to be kind of a general inspiration, not directly referencing an exact scene. Him singing at the piano in this intro does come from something specific. Flip the Frog, a classic 1930s cartoon made by the same people who made Mickey Mouse, particularly the introduction to his show, just like Over the Garden Wall. Although Flip's intro is much more upbeat, while Over the Garden Wall has a very somber tone. I think this is on purpose as an introductory scene to Over the Garden Wall because it shows us that this is going to be filled with classic references, but they're going to be a lot more somber in tone. Let's watch these scenes so you can see what I mean. Okay, let's talk about the midwife spitting up fish and the tailor crying in Over the Garden Wall. There's a lot of weird things going on with most of the people in the tavern, but these are definitely two of the most absurdist examples. But I looked into it a bit, and I think I have an answer for both. Although if you guys have better theories, feel free to share them. Let's start with the tailor because I feel more confident in why I think he's crying. I think it's one of two possibilities. The first is that it's a reference to the working conditions of tailors in the 19th century. Being a tailor, or especially a seamstress, in the 19th century was apparently really difficult. The working conditions and the actual labor itself was a lot harder. And this is the era most of the show is referencing. A popular trope of tailors and seamstresses at the time was that they were overworked and underpaid. It was very common to see tailors used in anti-sweating campaigns, which were like anti-sweatshops, furthering the idea that the profession as a whole was overworked. I actually found a lot of interesting things about what it was like to work in this industry in the 19th and 20th century because the University of Warwick has amazing record keeping on the history of tailors. Anyways, the image of a sad tailor makes sense for the era that Over the Garden Wall is trying to emulate, and he could be a direct reference to these anti-sweating campaigns. Now, an alternative theory that I've seen a few people make online and also works well with what the Artbook says about this episode is that the tailor is sad because he doesn't have any work to do. He's trapped in this tavern, and while some people are still able to do their jobs, like the tavern keeper or the toy maker, he is not able to do his. And here's a quote from the Artbook that explains why it might upset him. Back in the day, people didn't have the same sense of individual identity that we do now. You were more defined by your circumstances than by something inside of you. So I thought it would be interesting to look at people who define themselves by their roles in society and contrast that with a more modern boy like Wirt. So the tailor, like everybody else in the tavern, defines himself by his role as a tailor. Without any ability to complete this role, he ends up particularly depressed. He can't currently be a tailor, but who is he if he's not the tailor? The Artbook also goes on to explain how this episode really highlights Wirt's struggle with understanding his own identity, and I think it's interesting that the tailor of all people is the one to assume that Wirt's talking in metaphors. In all likelihood, the tailor crying is probably some combination of this historical reference, the fact that he can't do any work, and just kind of an absurdist humor thing to add in. Which is also how we get to the midwife spitting up the fish. It's obviously meant to be there in part for a comedic effect. Since she's a midwife, spitting up the fish is probably a reference to giving birth or delivering a baby. Although I'm not exactly sure why it was a fish. Around the 19th century, a lot of medical advances were happening, and midwifery was becoming a less and less popular job because people were choosing to give birth in hospitals instead. I didn't see anything about how that would connect to the midwife spitting up a fish, but I do think it's possible that she's trying to hold on to her job as a midwife. Not only was her role in society becoming a less popular one, but like the tailor, she's not actually able to complete her job in the tavern. So spitting up the fish is the closest she's able to get to delivering a baby. It could also be a reference to the complicated relationship between fish and pregnancy. Some fish are really bad to eat when you're pregnant because they have high levels of mercury in them, but some other fish are actually extremely beneficial to eat when you're pregnant because they have, really good nutrients for the baby, like salmon. I definitely don't think that's the intention here, but it is an interesting aspect to it. I feel like if there is a specific reference happening here, this one is going to require a lot more research to figure it out, unless one of you know what it might be a reference to. But anyway, I'm pretty confident that her spitting up the fish is a way for her to emulate her role in society as a midwife, but I'm not entirely sure why it's a fish specifically. Let me know if you guys want me to look into any of the other tavern people, because this was pretty fun to do. Let's talk about some shows and other media that are like Over the Garden Wall. Despite pulling from so many classics, Over the Garden Wall is a very unique show, so it can be difficult to find something comparable. That being said, I've put together a pretty large list of shows that I highly recommend you check out if you liked Over the Garden Wall, and I also will put some books and games at the end that I also think you should check out. And the reason the list is a decent size is because I wanted to have a good mixture between shows with a cute aesthetic but dark undertone and a lot of depth, and shows that are like a autumnal vibe. And for each one, I'll explain why I think it's a good recommendation for people who like Over the Garden Wall, so you can pick and choose which ones you want to check out based off of what sounds most interesting to you. Also, keep in mind that the book recs at the end are probably going to be a lot closer in terms of vibe and aesthetic than a lot of these shows. The first two that we're going to start with, I think, are the closest show recommendations I can get to Over the Garden Wall. Technically, the first one isn't even actually a show, but a collection of movies. It is also one of the probable influences on the show that I haven't talked about yet, and that is Studio Ghibli films. Most of these are stories that begin with a light aesthetic, but have children who get transported to an alternate world that is a lot darker. They also pretty much all have a lot of depth to them. They also tend to be inspired by older media and folklore, although not Americana specifically. I personally recommend checking out Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle first. If you want something that skews younger, My Neighbor Totoro has some Over the Garden Wall aesthetics. My roommate also told me to recommend Ponyo and Princess Mononoke. My next recommendation is another one that I could make a million videos on, like I have with Over the Garden Wall. And it's deceptively dark and gets increasingly so as it goes on. And I also suspect that Over the Garden Wall may have had an influence on the main villain. This is Centaur World. This is a warhorse living in a dark, gritty world. but one day finds herself in the magical realm of Centaur World and goes on a journey to find her way home, meanwhile slowly learning the dark truth about this cutesy, goofy land. I could talk so much about this show. I think it's very underrated despite being rated pretty high. However, I will warn you, it is very musical. Like, a bunch of these characters are voiced by Broadway actors. The Nowhere King also has a very similar aesthetic to the Beast. The next one I think is not actually that similar, although somehow I think anybody who likes Over the Garden Wall probably would like it also, and in my mind, it's Summer Over the Garden Wall. And that's Gravity Falls, which is about these twins who move to their uncle's lodge over the summer, which is in the middle of a magical forest with a lot of dark secrets to it. And now that I say it like that, I actually think the comparison is pretty obvious. The next two are kind of obligatory recommendations because they're the things that Patrick McHale, the creator of Over the Garden Wall, worked on before this show. Of the two, I think you can really see the influence that The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack had on Over the Garden Wall. This is a very similar vibe in terms of creepiness. It's very funny, but also filled with a lot of uncanny valley imagery. And I probably will talk about this show again in the future sometime. The other show Patrick McHale worked on was Adventure Time. This is a seemingly goofy story at first that gets more and more detailed over time. I consider it a kind of precursor to Steven Universe if you've seen that show. It is very good, especially if you want something longer than Over the Garden Wall. And it kind of takes place in a seemingly post-nuclear war world, with this being the last human, but outwardly appearing to be a lot of goofy fun at first. The next show I recommend is going to be another Halloween-y children's horror show, but this one is especially for anybody who identifies with these letters. If you identify as any kind of LGBTQIA label and you like Over the Garden Wall, then I really highly recommend this show. I honestly recommend this show to most queer people I meet who like anything animated. Dead End Paranormal Park is about these teens who work at a haunted amusement park. It's very good Halloween vibes, it's very gay. My only complaint about this show is that it was canceled after 2 seasons, and I wish it went for longer. But I still recommend those 2 seasons to anybody who's interested. The main character here is also a trans man, which is really cool and unique for this media. Here's a picture of me and my husband cosplaying from it for Halloween. The next recommendation is specifically for adults who are into the surrealist elements of this show. I honestly don't even fully know how to describe Bee and Puppy Cat because of how surrealist it is. This show is just a wild ride of weird, but also cutesy, but also surreal and uncomfortable. But definitely for adults, most of these are like middle grade recommendations. This one is not. The last show rec is pretty much for the autumn vibes, but also some historical and mysterious aesthetics as well. This is The Owl House, which is also about a teenager who gets put into an alternate world. Luce is learning magic while also discovering some of the dark secrets of this world. This character's a witch, and this character's like a little baby demon. I would say it gets more Over the Garden Wall-y in like the second season onward, but the first season's also really good. Some honorable mentions are Hilda, which I haven't seen, but I have heard compared aesthetically to this show. Also, I sometimes see Tim Burton films compared to this show, which I understand. I wouldn't necessarily say that if you like this show, you probably will like any Tim Burton film, but I thought I'd put it in here as an honorable mention. Now, let's get into some book recs. The first one is going to be The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. There are a lot of good comparable Neil Gaiman works like The Graveyard Book and Coraline, but this story, in my opinion, is one of the closest vibes to Over the Garden Wall. Very dark, surreal, foresty aesthetic, children protagonists in magical foresty settings. Not so much the humor that Over the Garden Wall has, but everything else, I feel like this has a lot of its vibes. It's also just a really good book. The next 3 are just some obvious classics you might enjoy since Over the Garden Wall was influenced by them. Obviously, there's Dante's Inferno or The Whole Divine Comedy. You can watch my pin video to hear about this. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has a lot of clear aesthetic influences. Very fall Americana in the same time frame that Over the Garden Wall is typically pulling from. And lastly, for the classics, anything by Edgar Allan Poe. Through the Looking Glass and Wizard of Oz are probably enjoyable for people who've seen this show and want to read more of the things that it referenced, and pretty much any American lit from the late 1800s. Lastly, here are some games I recommend for people who like this show. The first I haven't played, but it is based off Over the Garden Wall. It's a tabletop RPG called Babes in the Wood. It looks really fun, and it's the only thing on this entire list that is explicitly based on the show. There's one other game on this list that I haven't played, and that's Night in the Woods. I've mostly seen this compared to Over the Garden Wall in terms of aesthetics, and just from looking at it, I can see that there are a lot of aesthetic similarities. Dark, spooky, mystery, fall feelings, while still having like a cute and possibly funny vibe. The next two I have played, and I think they're pretty popular, so you probably have already heard of them, but if not, I still recommend checking them out. They're both really good. The first is Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch. This is a game that was made by Studio Ghibli. Like Over the Garden Wall, I could make a million videos about this game. This is about Oliver, whose mother dies saving him at the very beginning of the game, and he finds out about this magical world that he travels to, hoping that he can bring his mother back. It is a great exploration in grief, and it is also a Mon Tamer game, which I love. And it's a very unique one, not like Pokemon or anything. But the real Over the Garden Wall selling point is that, like the other Studio Ghibli films I was talking about, it has this cute aesthetic, but an increasingly dark story, with a lot of deep themes that it explores. And finally, we have Undertale. I don't know if people normally compare this to Over the Garden Wall, but I saw one person compare it, and I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You're a kid who gets trapped in this magical dark underworld, and you get to choose how you try to escape from the world, either by befriending anybody who gets in your way or by killing them. And the story changes by the different interactions that you do. But in all cases, it has this like dark undertone to it. And it has a lot of references also, although to much more contemporary things than Over the Garden Wall does. Anyways, that's all the recommendations I have. Some of them were very similar to Over the Garden Wall. Others were kind of out of left field. But I think no matter what, if you enjoyed this show, there's something on this list that you'll also enjoy. And if you guys have any other recommendations, please share them. And let me know if you want me to talk more about any of these. For our last Over the Garden Wall video of 2023, I'd like to talk about an important character that I haven't touched on too much yet, and that's Beatrice. There's kind of two ways to look at Beatrice, and that's how she fits into the story of Wirt and Greg, and how she fits into her own story. When it comes to Wirt and Greg's story, everything symbolic that Beatrice seems to represent implies that she is a trustworthy person. Her name is Beatrice as a reference to the character from Dante's Inferno. Beatrice was a woman who Dante loved but died before the events of the poem. And from the afterlife, she is the one who sends for Dante to go on this quest, traveling through the Inferno up the mountain of Purgatorio and meeting her at the top of it, where she then takes him and guides him through all of Paradiso. She gives Dante knowledge, love, guidance, and protection through his journey. And these kind of symbols are not only represented by this Beatrice having the same name, but also her being a bluebird. Bluebirds are meant to bring happiness and are a sign of good fortune. They also are distinctly native to North America, which falls in line with this story constantly referencing Americana. And Beatrice herself being a bluebird is part of these references to American folklore, as bluebirds have traditionally been seen as a sign of spring and warding off winter, especially snow, which fits in line with the episodes that Beatrice is no longer with Wirt and Greg. It starts to snow. And she is the one who saves Wirt from the frozen lake and then leads him to his brother through all of this snow and ice. She fulfills the role of a bluebird bringing back spring. This, coupled with her being an allusion to Beatrice from Dante's Divine Comedy, makes it all the more interesting that she's the one who originally plans to portray Wirt and Greg. And this is where I want to get into what this story means for Beatrice herself. Many people have read Over the Garden Wall as a sort of modern fairy tale. It has a very similar vibe and structure to classic fairy tales, but with slightly more modern ideologies and aesthetics. And the other day, I read somebody mention that Beatrice seems to be within her own fairy tale separate from Wirt and Greg. She has a unique quest and goal independent of theirs. And if that's true, I think Beatrice is meant to be a sort of Beauty and the Beast. Specifically, her being the beast from the fairy tale, not the beast from Over the Garden Wall. Besides the love aspect, Beatrice's story is actually quite similar to the fairy tale beasts. Her and everyone she lives with were cursed to transform into non-human creatures because of an unkindness that she presented to a stranger. I mean, stranger might be a strong term, but she threw a rock at a bluebird who cursed them, while the fairy tale beasts insulted or turned down an old beggar woman who turned out to be an enchantress who cursed him and everyone he lived with. For her, they all turned into bluebirds, while the beast turned into an ugly creature, while all of his servants turned into furniture. Now, part of the point in that story of the beast is him learning to become a good person. He needs someone to fall in love with him for who he is, not his outward appearance. And a big part of that happening is his interactions with Belle, or the beauty character, and him learning to care about her and thus become a better and kinder person through the empathy that he first exhibits with her. Beatrice is a very similar, gruff, bad person character, like the fairy tale beast. She's manipulating these boys for her own selfish gain, and while she's not directly a mean or bad person, she often at the beginning does not consider other people's feelings. And this is actually a really jarring aspect of her character because she's a bluebird. She seems like she's going to be a kind and friendly person, but she's actually kind of blunt and easily annoyed and often picks on Wirt. But her ability to empathize with other people grows through her connection to Wirt and Greg. And as the series goes on, she becomes a kinder and better person. And while technically her being a better or kinder person is not directly tied to the curse, it is why she's able to eventually break it, because that's why Wirt gives her the scissors. She learned to be kind and caring through these boys and displayed acts of kindness without any expectation in return, and this is kind of the fairy tale lesson that she presents. Being kind while not expecting anything in return benefits you both on the inside and the outside. And after learning this lesson, her, just like the fairy tale beast, is finally able to be a human again. And she can finally be okay with seeing her family again after having cursed them. Being unkind creates a trickle effect of negativity that affects everyone that you interact with. That unkindness led to her family getting turned into bluebirds. It led to Wirt and Greg getting trapped at Adelaide's temporarily. But doing acts of kindness that might even seem to hurt yourself at first, such as freeing them from Adelaide's, which loses her the scissors, will eventually lead to your own happiness and the happiness of those around you. And in this way, she finally becomes the true symbol of the bluebird and of Beatrice. Her whole story, at least to me, seems to be about learning to become these symbols that she is for Greg and Wirt. Becoming the person with goodness and guidance that people expect her to have. And she does this without losing who she is. She still feels like Beatrice at the end, but now she is a kinder, wiser, more grown-up version of herself. She's finally completed her coming-of-age story.
And how the gentle wind beckons through the leaves as autumn colors fall. Dancing in a swirl of golden memories, the loveliest lies of all.
I think Greg's dream is referencing Paradiso, but he never actually makes it there. These cherubs come to him from the stars, and Paradiso takes place in space. In fact, according to Dante, the cherubim live right beyond the stars in the next sphere. And they separate Greg's soul into an ethereal body that travels up with them, which is what happens to Dante when he travels to Paradiso. The Queen of the Clouds also gives off an angelic feeling, and I think she is meant to seem like Beatrice, who brings Dante through Paradiso. You can see that there are birds flying around her, just like the Beatrice in Over the Garden Wall is a bird. But she represents a false promise, and I think this is where the reference to Paradiso ends and brings us back into realizing that this is still the Inferno. This episode represents the seventh circle, violence. We know this because Wirt giving up on life is slowly turning him into an Edelwood tree, and in Dante's Inferno, people who end their own lives are turned into trees. But also I think it's interesting how many people in Cloud City are like anthropomorphized animals or objects, because the seventh circle is full of half animal, half man creatures. Most notably, the Minotaur, Harpies, and Centaurs. It's also worth noting that turning into trees is not the only punishment that happens in the seventh circle, it's just the one that happens to people who commit violence against self. People who commit violence against neighbors are submerged in this boiling river, which I think is clearly referenced at the end of this episode when Wirt drives Greg away and then goes looking for him and falls into a river of ice, which is like subverting the boiling but still submerging him. There's also a punishment for people who commit violence against God, nature, and art, which is basically being trapped in a storm that rains fire. The Old North Wind arguably makes more sense in the second circle, but I think it still works here as a possible reference to this kind of storm that these people experience. Either way, what I think is happening here is that Greg is being given a glimpse of Paradiso, but he is still stuck in the seventh circle. And it makes me wonder what would have happened if he gave in to the Queen of the Clouds' offer. We've talked about her possibly being the beast in disguise before, And I think this is the perfect kind of deception if that's the case. It's been a bit since we've talked about Over the Garden Wall, and I just realized something about Greg that I have to share. So we've talked a bit before about the inspiration for Wirt's design, but not really Greg's. And, you know, part of that is because Wirt's design is kind of up for debate. Like, the hat is clearly a reference to Dante, but the rest of it's a little unclear. But that is not the case for Greg. Just like the rest of this show, his appearance is a direct reference to classic Americana. And I don't know how I didn't see it before, but Greg's design is clearly inspired by Johnny Appleseed. Paw on his hat, the satchel, the shirt, like all of the classic Johnny Appleseed staples are in Greg's design. Main difference is the teapot and the overall, which are used to reference Shirley Temple. For the most part, the inspiration is hard to not see here. I just think Greg carrying around pieces of candy is similar to Johnny carrying around his seeds.
I can leave a trail of candy from my pants.
If you know anything about Johnny Appleseed's history, there's some other interesting things you might notice here. For example, Johnny is originally from Massachusetts. I used to drive by this sign in Leominster all the time that said birthplace of Johnny Appleseed. But he traveled west with his younger half-brother. Johnny was 18 and his brother was only 11. Kind of like how these characters seem to be early teenager and like, I don't know, 6. There's a similar age gap happening even if these characters are younger. Kind of an interesting subversion here with Greg being the younger brother, but this story really plays into that subversion, with Greg thinking that he's supposed to be the leader and Wirt kind of failing near the beginning of the story and throughout it at being the older brother. Big part of the story is Wirt learning how to be a leader, be the older brother, and when he finally does, Greg no longer looks like Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed has also been mythologized as having like a special connection to animals and traveling with them. Kind of like how Greg brings the frog everywhere and also hangs out with the schoolyard animals. Johnny also was a missionary. A lot of his traveling to plant all of these seeds was a part of his like spreading Christianity as well. And while Greg isn't doing that, the fact that this is like a retelling of Dante's Inferno and Greg has a connection to Virgil is noteworthy, I'd say. Although I think less of a direct connection to Johnny Appleseed than all of these other things. Knowing that Greg is dressed like Johnny Appleseed also makes you realize that both of these characters are dressed like historical references, but then say they are something completely different. Like, Wirt says he's a gnome, but is dressed in a military uniform, and Greg says he's an elephant, but is dressed like Johnny Appleseed. It's not just a reference to us, the audience, but within the show itself, these could have been their Halloween costumes. I wonder if it has something to do with the fact that Greg feels like a subverted version of Johnny Appleseed. Almost everything that connects him to Johnny is the opposite, almost. Like, he carries around candy instead of apple seeds, which, like, candy is almost the antithesis to apples. He's the younger brother instead of the older one, even though he tries to act like he's the older one, essentially. I don't know, it's worth thinking about, although I don't think it's fully just that. There are a lot of elements that do seem to more directly connect him to Johnny, such as his connection to animals. Also, their kind of happy-go-lucky attitude is part of, like, Johnny Appleseed's mythology as well. He always has this kind of smile on his face whenever he's depicted. Let me know what you guys think about this, because I only just now realized this and I was shocked. There's so much to this show, even the elephant costume.
It's an elephant costume. Woo! Woo! See my trunk?
I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on the creator of a work when trying to understand it. And I don't just mean like death of the author. I mean, we tend to think that one person did everything, made all of the creative decisions, and designed every piece of it. And while that's sometimes the case, especially for books, it usually isn't for shows. I mean, there's one person who might sign off on everything in the end, but they aren't actually the ones designing every single piece. Most shows are collaboratively made, even if there's one or two people at the helm. And I think Over the Garden Wall is a great example for this, because the art book that goes into all of the creative decisions that went into this show is written not only by the creator Patrick McHale, but the entire creative team. And we see plenty of ideas and decisions that were not Patrick's, but instead either someone else's or collectively decided on. For example, Nick Cross said he forced Pat to let him use this classic American animation gag of wiping and then holding your tear in place. He said this animation gag traumatized him as a kid, so they had to include it. It's not just the process of making the show, they even talk about their own interpretations being different. Nick Cross and Amalia Lavari shared different interpretations of what's happening to the people in the tavern, and their connection to the Edelwood tree outside of it. And it's not like the differing interpretations here or elsewhere in the book are like in conflict with each other or don't make sense, but they're not exactly the same, and that's what makes this such a masterpiece of a work, that you can take away so much from the story that even the people who worked on it can take away different meanings or have varying opinions on what inspired each piece, because it was created collaboratively, so not everyone worked on every single element of it. And basically all elements were done by multiple people. None of this is to discredit Patrick McHale. Being the creator is a huge part, and it's not wrong to accredit a lot of the details of this show to him. When trying to understand it, analyzing it for meaning, or even going into what could have inspired certain elements, he is not the only person that we need to be looking at. This is a big part of Death of the Author, but specifically how it works when it comes to other forms of media outside of literature. Patrick himself will even encourage alternative readings beyond what just he thinks about the show. There's one interview where someone's asking him about the different interpretations of the show, and he's like, yeah, sometimes people get exactly what I was going for, and other times they'll tell me something, and I'll be like, you know, I wasn't thinking of that, but that's a really good point. Fully acknowledging that the work goes beyond just what he envisioned for it. And part of that is for the typical Death of the Author reasons. A piece of work is separate from its artist, and even the artists themselves won't always know the subconscious elements that went into making it. But also, when it comes to shows, especially this one, there isn't just one artist. I think that's really cool and something we don't always value enough. There's no such thing as looking too deep into Over the Garden Wall because the show has so much intention and artistry to it that people have written entire dissertations on it. That being said, let's look too deep into why Greg dressed like an elephant and why that elephant looks like this. I think the answer to both is because of Wirt. At least for why Greg himself chose to dress like this. In a symbolic sense, the elephant thing is probably meant to further cement him into the wise fool archetype. Like, he has some profound moments of wisdom in the show like an elephant, but comes across as very silly and naive. The creator of the show, Patrick McHale, said he was designed after Johnny Appleseed. That's why it was a funny reveal when he says that he's an elephant, because for 9 episodes, we did not think that's what he was supposed to look like. And the characters within the show are also confused by this. That's very in line with the wise fool thing. People around him don't understand how his mind works. But I think beyond this symbolism, the reason Greg wanted to dress like an elephant and the elephant looks like this is because of Wirt. Greg idolizes Wirt, and as people have mentioned, aspects of his personality seem to be inspired by him. For example, he likes to sing all the time, and Wirt is a musician. And this obviously goes both ways. They inspire each other throughout the show. And as a child, what does Greg probably know about elephants? That they're large, smart, and make sound out of their long trunk. Kind of like his older brother, who to him is big, smart, and plays a clarinet. Of that, somebody commented in this video that he probably dressed like Johnny Appleseed because he just learned about him in school and decided to incorporate how he looked into his outfit. That's just kind of speculation on how a child's mind works, but it actually would make a lot of sense given their dynamic and Wirt's obsession with Americana. As we've talked about before, part of the reason why The Unknown is so 19th and 20th century Americana inspired is because that's the kind of thing that Wirt is interested in. We see that throughout his room, and a lot of those elements end up appearing in The Unknown itself. So this is an aesthetic that Greg already associates with his older brother Wirt. Whether or not he actually learned about Johnny Appleseed, Greg knows the aesthetics that Wirt loves, and he is dressed like them. Final side note about the Johnny Appleseed thing before we get back to him being an elephant, because I'm still not over not realizing that he was inspired by Johnny Appleseed after having seen this show so many times. This is the Artbook page about Greg. Here's Patrick McHale talking about how he was supposed to look like a sailor, but he was worried that he would look too much like Flapjack from The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack that McHale also worked on. McHale says Elsewhere would have been a reference to Childe Harold, but instead they went with a Johnny Appleseed look, and I'm so mad that this quote never made it into the show. I'm not Johnny Appleseed, I just have a pot on my head. Anyways, I also think it's worth noting that Greg kind of does act like a baby elephant also. He's very curious and almost fearless about the world, only trying to get into Wirt's business and understand him and help him. And he kind of just takes things. Not only does he have an episode where he talks about stealing, but he also just takes this frog and steals from Mrs. Daniels. It just reminds me of a personality that a lot of baby elephants have, along with the fact that he goes around sharing rock facts like he's trying to show off his elephant intelligence, even if they're just silly little things that he made up. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting symbolism here, and I would love to hear if you guys have any other theories as to why he's dressed like an elephant, but I think it primarily boils down to his inspiration from Wirt. In a lot of videos on Over the Garden Wall's connection to classic literature and early 20th/19th century Americana, today I'd love to tell you about one that actually never ended up making it into the show, which is the original concept for the Beast, aka Old Scratch. The original plan for this character is that he was going to promise the boys a way home by ripping up a book and scattering the pages into the wind, and then telling the boys they have to go find the pages and help the characters within the stories in order to get home. This probably would have been an interesting way to incorporate a lot of the Americana fairy tales that are referenced throughout the show. But what the boys don't know is that Old Scratch is evil. This little thing says, acts friendly and talks like a gentleman, but is the embodiment of evil. He's the devil who trapped Walter and Gregory, the original names for the boys, in the land of the in-between, the original name for the unknown. This is his description in the art book, which is also where we get the rest of the character's original concept. What I think is interesting about him is that he's very obviously less ominous than the Beast, and instead seems to be more of a trickster type. He is gentlemanly but secretly evil, and that fits with his more cartoonish aesthetic and also his name. Old Scratch is a 19th century name for the devil, which famously was in a story called The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving, who also wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And in this story, Old Scratch is a huntsman who chops branches with people's names on them. Similar to how in Over the Garden Wall, there is a huntsman who chops edelwood trees, which we know are made out of people, and then turns them into oil and burns them in a lantern that is keeping alive the Beast, aka the character that Old Scratch would eventually turn into. And as somebody who studies adaptations, this is so fascinating to me. We see a sort of adaptational through line from this character to the eventual concepts that would be in the show. Because who this guy was originally conceived to be doesn't necessarily have all of these elements. He just has the name Old Scratch. But then we see all of these other adaptational elements get put into the show while this name gets removed. And that's so interesting. There's so many layers to the symbolism in this show. It's crazy. Anyways, I just had to share this with you guys, and I will be making more videos on this show again soon. And I recommend that you follow me on YouTube because I might be releasing a long form video on it at some point in the near future.
Or is this just a very Jason Funderburker outfit? Because I kind of feel like it could just be this. Like, this is Jason Funderburker. Because everyone else is wearing a costume, right? Every single other character. So if he's not wearing a costume, what does that say?
I love this question, and to answer it, I'd like to show you a high school photo of the show's creator, Pat McHale, and you can tell me if it reminds you of anyone. Before we actually meet Jason, Wirt has built him up to be this cool hotshot guy that he doesn't even stand a chance against when it comes to Sarah's affection. But then we actually meet Jason, and we realize he's just a normal, awkward kid, and Wirt has just built him up in his mind because Wirt is insecure. Pat McHale himself said that Jason Funderburker's design was based on this photo. So one could kind of make the argument that his costume is that of McHale, the show creator. But the reality is he's not participating in Halloween. He's just a guy who dresses like this. And us seeing that further helps us realize that Wirt doesn't have to worry about Sarah being interested in Jason Funderburker. Sarah is very clearly into Halloween. She's wearing a costume in every scene that she's in. Wirt thinks of himself as a loser, and part of this journey is him realizing that he isn't, and that he actually has things to offer. And the reality is Jason Funderburker is even more awkward than he is. He just had a little bit more confidence than Wirt. But yeah, he's not wearing a costume. And as far as the colors go, I would say something interesting about them is that they kind of contrast from Wirt's design, which is, you know, showing that he is a rival in some way, but they are much duller than Wirt's. Wirt is wearing vibrant and interesting colors just as Sarah's costume seems to be, and how Sarah's personality seems to be, whereas Jason is wearing something very dull and boring. And practically every aspect of his design is meant to highlight how much cooler Wirt is. But yeah, in that regard, I also like to think of Jason as being a few stages behind Wirt in terms of like emotional development. He's at that stage of wanting to seem cool, but not understanding like how being himself is going to get him there, which is part of the self-actualization journey that Wirt goes on. Anyway, yeah, this was just a long way of saying he is dressed as Pat McHale. A lot of people are looking for something spooky to watch for Halloween today. I just want to introduce you to my favorite Halloween show if you haven't seen it before. It's called Over the Garden Wall, and it is wild. I love shows that are like deceptively cute. It seems like it's going to be this cute little adventure through the woods, but as it goes on, it gets darker and darker. And you can even see that in this cover art with the youngest character looking happy and adventurous while all the other characters aren't smiling. He in particular looking off into the dark unknown of the woods. It might seem like there's nothing deep going on in this picture, but that's a kind of aesthetic deception that the show is like all about. There's so many literary, musical, and artistic historical references throughout the series. Partner studies developmental psychology and I study history and literature, and this show is so perfect for us to talk about. Every time we watch it, there's more things that we notice. It's such good writing, and it really highlights how children's media can still be dark and funny and interesting. I'm being very vague about the plot because I really want people to watch this show, but it is something that I would love to talk more about because there's so many interesting interpretations that you can take away from this show, and they're just so fun to explore. It's actually a very short series too, so you can get through it really quickly. In total, I think it's only like 2 hours long. Basically just like a slightly long movie. We've rewatched it every October for the last 5 years, and we always watch it just in one sitting. It's basically about these two kids who get lost in the woods and are trying to find their way home, which sounds like a simple premise, but it gets just wild. Trust me, it is so worth checking out if you haven't. And it's not like dark in a horror way, it's more dark in like a psychological way. So unless you are a child, you probably won't find this frightening, but it is very dark. And absolutely worth checking out if you're looking for something Halloween-y to watch. And if you are inclined to like horror-esque stuff. Now I just want to make a bunch of TikToks talking about this show because it's so good and I'm trying so hard not to spoil things here, but it's so worth the discussions you can have after you've seen it. There's a great video essay that I highly recommend people watch if they've already seen this, talking about the music in it. My partner and I have also cosplayed from it going apple picking and pumpkin picking. And the people who recognized us were so excited by it because it's just so good. Yeah, deceptively cute, but gets darker as it goes on and very worth checking out. Over the Garden Wall, this cute little show is basically a retelling of Dante's Inferno. I'm not even close to the first person to say this, and if you've read Dante's Inferno and you see any episode of this show, then you will know that it's hard not to see it. This bird being named Beatrice and being like an introduction to the unknown is kind of your first hint that this is going to be Dante's Inferno, but it's so much more than that. So Wirt, aka Dante, is a love-struck artist and poet who goes through this creepy, hellish forest that exists outside of reality with his brother Greg, aka Virgil. Greg is the reason they're in the forest to begin with, and he leads Wirt even further and further by just jumping ahead and running towards whatever's next. Greg even refers to himself as the one leading them through the forest. Beatrice also helps guide them in a way, which is kind of like her being the guide in Dante's Paradiso. The Beast is so obviously Lucifer, it's not even questioned. He's literally called the Beast. He also has these evil little turtles that follow them subtly throughout the series. And he's not portrayed as evil for being just like this vicious creature or something. He's evil for being deceptive. He is the ultimate betrayer. Although the Edelwood trees might be the most obvious thematic reference to Dante's, in the Inferno, souls who committed suicide are doomed to be trees forever. And one of the major themes of the show is this question of giving up on life, either through death or through escapism, which, spoilers ahead, is represented by turning into the Edelwood trees. These trees are lost souls that are ground up and fed to the lantern. Now, even beyond this, some people have interpreted every episode as being a reference to a circle of hell. Episode 1 is the Gates of Hell, where the huntsman basically says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," fully warning them not to go further in fear of the beast. Episode 2 is the first circle of Limbo with the chill pumpkin village. Limbo in the Inferno is this space for people who were basically good people and not sinners, but were not baptized as babies, and therefore couldn't go to heaven. They get to just live in a chill village. I've seen people talk about the biblical connection here with the head of the pumpkin village being named Enoch. the ancestor of Noah. But in general, I don't think it's hard to see how this little village of skeletons in the middle of the unknown is a reference to the limbo. The next circle is for people whose sin was lust, and the next episode centers around the relationship between the teacher and her lover, and all of the conflict happening arises because of their relationship. Next is gluttony in the tavern, which not only are the tavern people constantly gloating, but also they seem to be eating all of the food that is being brought to Greg's table. And as another direct reference to the Inferno, they refer to Wirt as a pilgrim. And they initially think his pilgrimage has to do with love, which it does in both the Inferno and in the actual story itself, as we come to find out later. Next is greed in the story of Endicott, where these two crazy wealthy people fall in love, and our crew needs to steal change from Endicott. There's a lot of really interesting things happening in this episode actually because of this, but I'll talk about that in another video because it's going to be way too long. But their money is what causes these characters to be together and simultaneously be apart. And the fact that they're business rivals, like, the next episode / circle is where these parallels start to become much more direct. So even though Dante doesn't have to pay a fare to cross the river Styx, classically you have to pay in coins. 2 coins were placed over the eyes of dead people in order to pay the ferryman to cross the river Styx in classic Greek mythology. And in Over the Garden Wall, they had to steal 2 coins from Endicott in the previous episode so that they could pay for this ferry. This circle is anger, and there are a lot of pieces where that might fit. This is where we see the first, legitimate antagonist, and real conflict starts to arise between the characters. But not only is the ferry and the river being referenced here, but also the punishment of the sinners is to be stuck in mud, and at the end of the ferry, the frogs roll around in mud. Oh, and the string at Adelaide's is a reference to the Fates before Dante enters the city of Dis. The next circle is heresy, which has an emphasis on witchcraft, and in the episode, it's 2 Puritan aesthetic characters, and there's clearly a lot of witch imagery happening. Sorry for the quick outfit change. This clip somehow got erased from the original video, but now we're talking about the next episode and circle, which is violence. This episode is called Babes in the Wood, and it's where they go to sleep under a tree, and Wirt has given up any hope that they will find a way out of the woods, and he starts to turn into an Edelwood tree. It's also where we find out where the Adel trees come from, being people who've given up on life and theoretically committed suicide. And it's paralleling the same circle in Dante's, which is violence, particularly violence against self. There's also a fight that happens between Greg and the North Wind. It's a very interesting scene that we will talk about at some point. Next circle is fraud, and the episode is the backstory of what happened before all of this, where Wirt is clearly putting on a facade of himself and thinking he has to do that in order to impress Sarah. Constantly comparing himself to other people and just in general being worried about just being who he is. The last circle, treachery, parallels the last episode. They confront the beast just like Dante does. Greg is covered in the Edelwood branches and snow as his soul is being consumed, just like the souls in this level being covered in ice. The beast's treachery is also revealed here, and Beatrice's treachery is forgiven. Also, even though Greg is the more Virgil character, Beatrice shares this role to a degree, and she's the character left behind at the end. Which could be a reference to Virgil being left behind at the end of Inferno, or Beatrice herself, the character, being left behind at the end of the comedy. They leave the unknown in this episode just as Dante leaves the Inferno, and Wirt has grown significantly as a person because of this experience. It's arguable that Greg has too, but the story isn't really about Greg as much as it is about Wirt, at least in terms of development. Wirt is at a low point in his life. He is the most susceptible to the unknown, just as Dante is at a low point in his life and is most susceptible to the Inferno. And this experience was created specifically in order for him to overcome it. There are probably even more parallels than this to the Inferno. It's very clearly a